All right, here we go. So yeah, welcome everybody. We're talking.
Welcome.
Yes, hello. We are, Kelly and I are talking to you today about the post-pandemic studio. This is an event which is really a conversation that we're hoping to open up into a kind of discussion with whoever is joining us. Yeah, we'd like to start off with some land acknowledgements. So I'll begin. I'm in Vancouver at the moment. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm living and working is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Unceded land was never handed over to settlers. It was stolen and continues to be occupied and governed by settlers today. I believe it's important to continue reflecting and speaking about this colonial violence and to keep it in mind as we interact with one another. I'm grateful to the Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial.
And I'm joining everybody from Toronto today. Toronto folks, I want to acknowledge that the land that we're on today is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty to share the territory and protect the land. It's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We recognize that today this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, and we name settler colonialism as the root of ongoing systemic oppression of Indigenous peoples. Very importantly, decoloniality and anti-oppression are all of our responsibility. Also, extremely importantly, Katherine and I would really like to acknowledge the essential protests that are happening against anti-Black violence and or happening for anti-Black violence and oppression happening across the globe. We stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right, thank you, Kelly. Okay, so at this point, we'd like to introduce each other as a way of co-collaborating, co-facilitating the session. So Kelly Small is an award-winning creative director, designer, and writer with deep roots in communication design, marketing, advertising, and a special focus on ethical and inclusive practice. A proven creative leader, strategist, and affiliated design researcher with the Graphic Research Unit at Emily Carr, Kelly holds an interdisciplinary master's degree in design, where their focus was on creative industry ethics, social impact, social innovation, and sustainability. Kelly's forthcoming book, The Conscious Creative, Practical Ethics for Purposeful Work, will be published by House of Anansi Press. It's a collection of over 100 actions for a more ethical creative practice.
Thanks, Katherine. And this is Katherine Gillieson, Dr. Katherine Gillieson, who I have worked with quite a bit in the past. Katherine is my former MDes thesis supervisor. And so the book that Katherine talked about very quickly there was something that she's very close to, as most of the research that went into that book happened through my master's program. So we've worked lots together, and I'm very excited to be here with her today. Katherine Gillieson is a designer and associate professor at Emily Carr University, where she runs the Graphic Research Unit. Her design, writing, and research projects focus mainly in the areas of information design, editorial design, and the theory and philosophy of design. She's currently involved in something called the Super Lab Project, which is large-scale ongoing investigations into new ways of thinking about education and studio practice, focusing on themes of interdisciplinarity in practice-based research, art, and design ways of knowing, and the nature of visual literacy. The post-pandemic studio here today, culminating in the Information Design Summer Intensive, will take up some of these themes, engaging design as a form of meta-reflection on studio practice in the age of pandemic response.
Great, thank you, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Katherine. Thanks so much, Kelly. And now we're going to join the conversation in progress. Thank you both.
Cool.
By making it sort of socially acceptable for us to work from home and connect from anywhere and protect ourselves in that way. So we're going to be talking about all of these different sort of unexpected results of the pandemic and how we might, as creatives, be able to look at those things and go, you know, instead of just sort of throwing our hands up in the air and saying, well, I guess we'll see what happens. Like, we're the folks who design this stuff forward. Like, let's really pay attention to what's happening and develop a better experience for all of us as creatives and just as people moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's, Kelly, you just started with something that's so, it's so key, right? To understand it, or to starting to understand how we can reshape thinking about all the different ways in which people operate in the world. And, you know, just like, thank you for just the honesty and just being, you know, just being open about, you know, your own situation. It is so, it's really, we need to be, you know, looking at this from a point of view of a compassionate perspective and understand that a lot of different kinds of people are not easily able to get out there and join the world of commuting and workspace presence, you know, physical presence, you know, the social presence, and all of these different kinds of aspects that I think a lot of us take for granted in our everyday lives. So, you know, just the pandemic conditions have greatly changed our experience of everyday life and how we do things, whether we're working from home or not, or whether we've actually been, you know, put out of work and we have new things to do with ourselves. Some folks have kids and have found themselves in a situation where you have to work full-time and also full-time take care and homeschool your kids. You know, there's so many different kind of ways that the pandemic has had a huge impact. If you're a student and you were in education, you suddenly had a bunch of studio classes go online. What? You know, what was that about? You know, it's crazy, right? So these huge changes, all of these kind of had an impact on people in different ways. And I feel like it's really telescoped in a way, or kind of magnified, I guess the opposite of telescope. It's magnified, you know, something really personal about everybody. Like, how am I able to react in this situation? And I think for some people, there is a sense of comfort that comes from being able to stay home. There is a sense of, you know, being okay with working from home and actually possibly flourishing, possibly thriving in some of those conditions. I personally can entirely relate to that. You know, we were talking earlier about, you know, this idea of whether people, this is not really like a binary distinction, but if you're introverted or extroverted, for instance, and if you are more on the end of the spectrum of more introverted, you will have stress in your system from interacting a lot with people, and you do have to decompress after that, right? So what happens when you're working from home and you don't have that pressure, you don't have that anxiety, perhaps, you don't have that time, that cognitive load, right? We talk about the psychology of you know, the cognitive load on our senses, right? For people on the more introverted end. So I think these are things that we need to think about really carefully and appreciate moving forward, right? Despite all of the constraints and all of the downsides, I think that's something that we want to talk about more, and you know, hoping to talk to you guys about it as well. All of you in the audience, all the participants in here. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that issue in particular.
Yeah, and how that's affected you. I think just to keep going a little bit on this, and the you know, potential ramifications of being able to engage in a little bit more self-care. One of the actions in my book, The Conscious Creative, is commit to self-care, and how that relates to ethical practice is that when, I mean, it's proven that when folks have the space to take care of their own emotional needs, when we are not rushing around constantly, when we are able to live within our values and rest. We've all heard the term rest is resistance floating around a lot lately. Amazing things happen to our capacity to be kind to one another, to have compassion for one another, to actively work toward more, you know, we're centering inclusivity in those spaces. And so I really do hold that while I think the pandemic working world has, of course, impacted everybody significantly differently, that somewhere within there's like a nugget of wisdom, and that maybe we can all just sort of pick apart a little bit more to reimagine the working world in a way that is more holistically supportive to all people, and not just sort of one type of person, in the way that we talk a lot about kids and learning styles. Katherine and I both have kids. Like, there's, you know, the school system can be problematic because everybody's supposed to learn one way, but we all know that's not true. And the same is a fact for the way that we work and the way that we engage in our creativity and the circumstances that we require to be at our most optimally creative selves. So I think there's a lot in that. We have a hand raised.
Ooh, that's exciting. Yes, I noticed that.
Rania, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please.
Yeah, please go ahead,
Yes.
Rania.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hey.
Well, hi.
Yeah. Thanks for the amazing introductions. The land acknowledgements and the status quo acknowledgements were very nice to hear. I want to, in conversation, because that's one of the things I'm exploring for my residency work, is I'm trying to collect from those around me how they see care and what is the meaning of care, to try to build a mood board of what people see care as. And there's a couple of things that you both mentioned that I want to put out there as an idea, or just as a discussion point, maybe, in terms of self-care and in terms of cognitive load on the senses and all. But the more I'm hearing from people as I'm looking into the meaning of care, and given the situations we're in, whether it's the pandemic or global happenings and you know, riots and all that, I think that the way we address self-care needs to be reconsidered. Self-care seems to be very important. You have to work, like what I'm thinking about right now is that you really have to work on yourself, your own home, your own family, to be able to make sure that what you're putting out in the world is better. But in the same time, when it comes to self-care, people always have this idea that self-care is spa nights and you know, and going shopping, and like it's something not everyone can afford. Mm-hmm. And so it's become this word that is like more, I can't afford that. That's not for me, right? And it's so wrong that it is, because self-care could be as simple as, and I've shared some of those on my gratitude walls and the residency and all, but I recently discovered Zentangles, and all I do is just at night before going to bed, I will sit and do some Zentangles, and I'll be fine. I'll wake up, I'm fine, I'm rejuvenated, and that doesn't cost me anything. It's just a notebook I get from Dollarama and some colors, and I do that. That's not going to be for everyone, but that's one thing I discovered that can work. But
I think you make a great point.
Every time I speak to people about self-care, they think I can't afford it. It's too expensive. And I've had this conversation as I'm trying to discover what the meaning of care is with other organizations that work with newcomers and vulnerable communities, and some of them are working with temporary workers and caregivers who are working in senior homes and whatnot. And the problem is most of those workers don't think they deserve, not that they deserve, they don't have time for self-care. They need to work to provide for their families. And so self-care is a luxury they cannot afford.
That's, yeah.
It's such a good point. And I think sorry, Katherine, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, if you have some, go ahead first and I'll jump in.
Yeah, I'm really happy to. I hear you, Rania. Like, I think there are so many, I don't want to say misconceptions, because self-care is going to look different for everybody, but it's a great point in that I probably should have prefaced using that term with a little bit of here's how I define that, which is very much extricated from the marketplace. I do not conflate self-care and capitalism, and the idea that we must go out there and spend money on a spa or get our hair done or do any of these things in order to engage in self-care. You know, in the same way that self-care for you is Zentangles, which I'm going to look up after this, which sounds really interesting. For me, it's making a simple tea and giving myself like 10 minutes of complete silence and just breathing. You know, it's anything that you want it to be, and I completely agree that it does not have to do with money. And also, you made a point about folks who don't have a great deal of time. You know, time is also a privilege, and so that does need to be acknowledged.
Yeah, and that it's not selfish. You know, I think that a big part, and I really associated with your background, Kelly, when you first spoke, because I was in advertising and marketing before and then transitioned into not-for-profit. And sometimes I think in not-for-profit, we speak about concepts, and I kind of want to say, oh, I wish I could put that into a creative brief and give you an ad right now, because it could be a very simple way to communicate it. Because there's some things that are very, very wrong that we need to unlearn. So we need to work about unlearning it. And self-care has this perception and concept that it's selfish and it's expensive. And somehow we need to do something about that if we want to change the world. So yeah, I'm gonna quiet now.
I wanted to mention,
love it.
I also completely, appreciate your comment very, very much. It's so relevant, and we hadn't actually written notes about self-care, but I agree, and I love that Kelly brought up the capitalist, profit motive angle in there. I feel that self-care, that whole concept, is really a kind of a construct, and it's also been to a certain extent co-opted, right, by a consumerist kind of condition where you are going out and purchasing things to do the self-care, and that you do absolutely need, time and money, and you have to spend, like 24 hours at a spa or something. I find it incredibly individualistic as well. And this is another aspect of it that makes me kind of, shy away from that whole space. Maybe it is something that we need to take back, right? As something that has to do with building a resilience in community, right? In a community environment, in your immediate environment. Why do we differentiate between our oppressive, debilitating world of work versus my time to myself for 5 minutes at the end of the day? Why can't we have a holistic, healthy, balanced lifestyle where, we are feeling as though we're supported throughout the day and in interactions with people? I love the idea of changing my view of self-care. Yeah. So yeah, that's absolutely, well taken, and something, it's something to put in the to-do list, right? Like take it back, change, and re-envision what we mean by, what is the self, and how does that impact, what we could do with the future of this post-pandemic world.
That's such a good point, Katherine, about self-care currently being perceived as a moment. And I am as guilty of this as anybody else, but why can't? And in fact, what I'm talking about my, my life feeling a lot more possible right now, and being able to thrive in a way that I necessarily wasn't before because I have more space. It does feel like now self-care has stopped being a moment that I engage in at the end of a very, very busy week, but instead is more woven through the like everyday sort of fabric of my life. And so, yeah, I think it really does beg to be picked apart a little bit more and investigated for how we can redesign our worlds to incorporate more of that more holistically.
Yeah, and I think this kind of brings up another point that I wanted to make, because we had considered that issue of being traumatized by the pandemic conditions that we're living in, right? Like we have caused distress, we have caused an enormous amount of pressure. People feel traumatized, and I think I'm looking at some references here that link and that can compare the trauma and the anxiety that people have felt to the cognitive burden of having a full-time job on the side on top of everything else you're doing. This has a whole bunch of different ramifications in so many ways, right? In terms of the way that we live our lives, exchange thoughts with people, and organize ourselves. And one of the biggest ones is a sense of huge distraction. We're distracted by physical and emotional distress. Whether we know it or not, we have trauma. Some of us, I should say, it's not like sort of a blanket approach, but it's the idea of having internalized or having somehow this kind of like underlying element of trauma to our lives that has an impact on our ability to kind of just go about our daily business. And I think the self-care aspect is relevant, more so for me from a, that thinking about it as almost like a medical issue or a health and wellness issue, rather than what a lot of people think of as self-care as being icing on the cake, like I'm going to go and do a spa treatment just to make myself feel better. We're not talking
about being essential.
Yeah, it's actually kind of essential if we are thinking about this as a traumatic event that people that really would people will benefit in terms of their well-being and their functioning in society and everything else. It's just that's just such an important point. So thanks so much for bringing that up. Really.
The trauma piece, and I see that that's resonating in the chat as well. It really is incredibly important, and as we start to have more and more conversations about the things that we are defunding, police perhaps is a big conversation right now, and the things that we are redistributing those funds into, the greater conversation hasn't really turned to that collective trauma that we're facing and the need for improved mental health care across Canada, across the world. And so that's just something I just kind of want to drop that in there. And I think it's something to keep in mind as we all are pretty engaged in these conversations about what we're currently funding and what we haven't been, and how we can get involved in those conversations.
So I think this is at this juncture, I think it might be a good idea to move on from our personal dimensions and think about some of that, the aspects of the home office and the home studio, really, that were like part of that original kind of thought, how we're new ways of working, new ways of, conducting our practices in art and design.
Sure.
How post-pandemic affected this, disrupted this, supported this.
It makes me think about and not that all of the leaders of big tech are who we should be looking for guidance in our humanity. Just going to throw that out there. However, we know Shopify's CEO made a very, very public statement that has had quite a significant ripple effect across the tech world, across the design world, and all of those adjacent industries. And what he said was, the quote is, "Office centricity is over." And Shopify has now moved to a permanent remote first approach, and I'm seeing lots of companies following suit. And I'm really interested in digging into that a little bit and asking ourselves, okay, so this is no longer just about a sort of pandemic moment in time. If this is in fact our a piece of our new normal, how is that, like, what are the ramifications of that going to be? On our creative selves, on our, as creatives, we are deeply collaborative people on collaborations. Will it be affected? Our mental health, our well-being, sort of all of those pieces that we've been talking about. Just wanted to sort of throw that out there and see what we can dig into.
Absolutely, and I'm looking at the chat now. This is fantastic that you're able to make comments on all of this while we're talking about this. I think there are some huge changes in certain industries and not so much in others, and I feel that tech in particular has changed enormously. If anybody knows, or if you work yourself in a tech-related industry, or if you know anybody in IT, you may also know somebody who suddenly is working 12-hour days because they can barely keep up with the demand. And although Shopify did something that I think is actually fairly forward-thinking and really facilitating new ways of working for people, especially in the post-pandemic world, at the same time, it's not something that we can easily facilitate in any industry, right? So it's a bit like the tech industry is easily able to buttress this new way of working through tech, right? And how are the rest of us going to fare trying to do that, right? How are we doing that in education? How are we doing that in health? And how are we doing that in government services? Again, it becomes an issue of access to technology to a large extent, and there are huge security implications. And yeah, that whole side that you mentioned, Kelly, about security, privacy concerns, and all of that other is enormous.
I know quite a few companies have already installed employee monitoring software onto company computers for folks who are working from home, which is really interesting. I would say, and arguably a violation of a person's privacy, and something that I personally am happy to go on the record saying I don't think that's going to be beneficial for anybody's productivity or your relationships with the people with whom you work. But there, as with anything else, as we're so used to talking to in design, is this idea that anytime something new is implemented, there are going to be a whole host of unintended consequences, good, bad, everything in between. And so, I'm just going to keep sort of coming back to this place that as creatives, we are the folks who can do that futuring, can do all of that foresight, and really start to imagine the full breadth of implications of this new world, and do our best to ensure that we keep stewarding ourselves and our industries and the communities that we can impact into the sort of right areas.
Yeah.
I think we have a hand raised. Rania?
Oh, no, that's just probably me not knowing how to take it down.
Take it down again.
Oh,
yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, I think there is another lens as well, and I think, Kelly touched on this earlier. Talking about our people who are working or out in the world in some way, they're considered edge cases, and precisely, if you find yourself with a trauma that's more fulsome, some mental health situation, neurodivergent folks on the autism spectrum, any kind of otherly abled person who has some kind of like access constraint in the world of work of everyday life and commuting. There are some opportunities here that we need to think very, very carefully about. How can we really encourage, well, maybe this is actually more of a systemic issue. How do we encourage the companies, government structures that are right now trying to react as quickly as possible to rearrange our daily routines in a way that will keep things afloat, to really create the conditions for the best practices that we can have, to support people moving forward. And when we're talking about structural inequality and structural injustice, the system will tend to try and level itself out to keep going, rather than supporting the humans, that are like feeding the system. And I think this is an aspect that we really want to be very careful about, and something that we should touch on later as well.
Mm-hmm.
The systems of power, right, tend to stay in power. So how do we provide and how do we support folks who are less able or less have that accessibility issue that we're talking about in the regular world of work?
Yeah, it sort of makes me think a little bit about the Japanese have a word karoshi, which translates to I think exactly like overworked to death. And this idea of that this really paradigm that we've all been in for a very long time, really, since sort of the turn of the former centuries, is this capitalism and relentless growth and the commitment to the corporation above like commitment to like humanity's best interest, the earth's best interest, animals' best interests. I feel like, Katherine and I have been talking about this pandemic as this potential pivot point, in that, any disaster brings about these opportunities for change, where we suddenly find funds available to us that before we're just like, oh, we could never throw that much money at that thing, and all of a sudden all of these things become available. And the reason I bring this up is because I think this is an opportunity for us to reject this relentless growth model where we are, really compromising the well-being of employees, of families, of communities, of our creative selves. And I really wonder how the pandemic will act as a bit of a catalyst to dismantle that and start to center something a little bit different. But I think, like everything else, it's a choice, and it's going to require a lot of voices. It's going to require a lot of folks banding together and agreeing that, that is in fact the best way forward.
I just noticed that there is an excellent question or comment put out in the comments, which is, can we just wait until there's a vaccine? And I don't know if, Katherine, you want to share a comment on the audio, but I certainly think that, one of the most interesting things about this situation is that we've found ourselves in a place where, by and large, we're not in a position to move back to the way things were before, even when there is a vaccine. There's going to be a new normal, whether or not it's, we're not talking about lockdown when we talk about the new normal. We're talking about post-lockdown, post-pandemic. And moving forward, we do see, certain systems have shifted in a way that actually seem a little bit better than they were before. There's a few things that are happening in Vancouver that folks have really enjoyed. The decrease in traffic, for one. There's a bit more wildlife. The kind of visiting people in their backyard. There's some things that people actually appreciate from that social distancing period that we had. And I think that a lot of the things that people have moved online or on the phone will be up for a review. Like I've heard, people talk about the ability for physicians, medical professionals to consult with patients over the phone, and how this is so much more convenient for so many reasons. If you need to refill a prescription and you're elderly, getting yourself to the doctor's office and waiting in line and seeing someone in person is a huge amount of work, right? But picking up the phone and having that conversation to refill your vaccine is so much more simple and direct and less inconvenient. These kinds of systems, those little things that actually have a big impact. Even if there's a vaccine, we're not going to go back to normal. We're not going to be doing exactly how we were doing things before. And also, we've all changed. The fact that we've even been through this level of lockdown and trauma, that in itself means we're not going to be back to normal. We're going to have people wearing face masks, 24/7, whether it actually has any medical reason for it or not. I've seen lots of people driving cars wearing face masks. What's with that? Right? Like, that's actually not. I mean, like, if you look at what the reason is that you would wear a face mask, it's like, I don't understand that one, but that is, what's going to happen is we're reacting.
Jump in here for a moment, because actually you understood me to be saying the opposite of what I meant, which is that I'm 58 years old with vulnerable lungs, and so it's not post-pandemic until there's a vaccine.
Right.
Furthermore, I'm from the United States, and I'm having a hard time envisioning how I get to go back there. So there's like, when this post-pandemic is not evenly distributed. Some of us are going to be in pandemic for a lot longer than some of the other people, but I mean, really, particularly in the case of the United States, where they really have not dealt with their outbreak, the pandemic is going to go on a lot longer than people think it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks so much for clearing that up. I mean, I appreciate your where you're coming from. Actually, is I can relate to this in a certain way, because I'm currently living with my elderly father. We brought him up in February from the States. He has an American passport. And he came up with us at the end of February, and he hasn't been able to go back. So he's been kind of trapped in Canada, so to speak, with an American credit card, American health insurance, and he is in a high-risk group as well. So when I talked about that, refilling a prescription by phoning the doctor rather than going out and actually sitting in the waiting room, that we were, viscerally in that situation of appreciating that, in a very real way. And that is something that we need to keep thinking about, that reality of the health implications is so real. And I think that this idea of the lockdown has different, like we were talking about different spaces and different ways of reacting for different people. That health dimension is one of those places, I think, where we do have a bit of a hard line, right? If you are immunocompromised, you have that hard line that you have to deal with, right? That you don't want to, and if you are in a certain group of people that will be more vulnerable, then you may want to quarantine yourself in certain cases. Whereas other people are feeling a little bit more open and free to walk around and do whatever. Regardless of this, I think we are looking at a lot more social distancing and staying at home and working from home and having to do everything from home. That is, I think that's like, that is really like the place where we want to see how we can reinvent the systems that we're building up.
Yeah, exactly. The hope is, even once a vaccine is hopefully very soon found and implemented, that we are able to redesign systems so that folks with, all sorts of health issues, various disabilities, the idea is to use this as a catalyst to help sort of redesign those systems so that it works better for all of us once all of this is over. So thanks so much, Katherine, for sharing that. It's a really, really important, I think, lens that we all need to look through and be super aware of.
I put up
cross for that order. Yes. Hi, Rania.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't speak over anyone, but you know what? It's what you're saying sometimes when it comes to about, designing what's going to be post-pandemic. What worries me at the point, even from looking at, current government policies or whatnot, is that how can we protect the way forward from people picking what is easy versus what is right? Because governments, most of the time, even you can see from all the, the new programs that were set out, is that they're always gonna look towards what is easy to do right now, but they won't look at the foresight of what that is going to have an implication. And here we have this opportunity to dismantle something we all relatively agree around the world that life needed to change somehow. Majority of people maybe believe that, but because we were all shocked, that system got a shock of this pandemic, where people are just running around and kind of thinking, let me think about how am I gonna, get back on my feet as easy as possible, but not necessarily as right as possible. So when we talk here as a group of residents or students, or how, as much as how we can help moving forward after the pandemic, I think that a very big part is how we need to think about how can we make sure it's going to be set up right and not just the easy way to do it, right? Mm-hmm. Not rushed, basically.
You've made some excellent, that's so insightful, that idea that we are looking at a system that tends to just also look for short-term solutions and kind of writes itself in a way that is, probably the best way that it can be in a short term without any kind of long-term planning, long-term thinking.
There are a lot of organizations, if I can jump in, that are really spearheading this. The Leap, I don't know if anyone's heard of that, is one that I've worked with quite a bit. And depending on the government, of course, the NDP are very big on moving forward in the ways that we're discussing here. And so it's a bit like everything else. I mean, maybe one of our caveats up front should have been that, we understand, of course, the systemic barriers to enacting all of this. However, as creatives, I think it's incredibly important that we continue to have the conversations so that we are as empowered as possible with the visions necessary to go into these spaces and help lead the folks who are sort of at the helm of the movements in those directions that we want to see it happen. And also just, I think it's a good segue into sort of moving into the social dimensions of this, where I wanted to open up the social dimensions with this idea that a lot of design processes, as you mentioned, Rania, we want to have the luxury of time. We want to be able to iterate. We want to be able to test and ensure that we're putting something out in the world that is going to be effective, and we wait until it's suitable for the public. We didn't have that opportunity in this situation. This the sort of experience that we're all having now and the working world that we're all existing within now had to be designed, and I use that term loosely because it happens so quickly, but very, very fast. And I wanted to bring that up because I think, there's some benefit to the idea of implementing quickly, learning as quickly, implementing and iterating sort of as we go. And I just thought it might be an interesting place for us to sort of stop and think about any like key insights that we've learned from this existing implementation and how we're working now, and what from this already we're seeing as being problematic, unintended consequences. Any sort of key insights from that.
Yeah, I think that's a really, when we look at that social dimension of working from home in the post-pandemic era, I guess our thoughts as designers automatically go to, how can I design this situation better, right? Like use design to kind of improve our state, because we are inherently thinking about designing our world all the time. And I think there is something to, Kelly, your excellent questions. And if anybody has any thoughts about these, definitely jump in. And I appreciate that the pandemic kind of conditions have created a kind of meaningful inefficiency for us to kind of sit back and think a little bit more about things. And I'm not saying that we have some sort of like great power to make changes. I feel like sometimes we overestimate how we, our abilities to enact any, meaningful changes. I mean, so many of us are corporate shills after all. And, I think I'm sort of saying that as a kind of, I'm meaning it in a really nice way, and a kind of like, we do have a huge amount of work ahead of us in that space. And it's not just design and art and other people who are creatives or, studio practitioners. We need to think about everybody as being, having the potential of a designer. And in, finding ways to see other people who we see as, usually we might see them as the audience or as our users or something like that, seeing them as having the potential to create their own new ways of seeing the world and giving them the opportunity to be the designers. I guess this goes back to the idea of, what is the real space for design? And we're talking about not just co-design, but really expanding that whole, the epistemology of it has to change, right? And I think that is, how much can we do as artists and designers to change things that are around us? And part of that, a huge amount of the power that we have might be, for whatever that small amount of power is, might be really to share our ways of working and our ways of, whatever empowering ways we do things, share those, right? And bring
Fantastic.
people into those conversations.
The idea that Katherine was talking about sort of getting rid of that age-old notion of like the top-down designer as expert is something that I'm really passionate about too. And I like to think of designers as more of facilitators. And if anybody here wants to read any more about that, a great resource is a guy named Ezio Manzini. He has a book called Design When Everybody Designs, and it's it's a great sort of introduction to social innovation, and social innovation, or design for social innovation, is really rooted in a lot of the topics that Katherine was talking about, and it really does sort of make you rethink our role as creatives. And it's a dense read. That's not a lie, but I recommend it. I think it's a good one as well. I think it's necessary.
That's okay. When you have some, if you are one of those people that's had more time on their hands, instead of making sourdough, what we should do is go and read some Manzini. Anyway, sorry, that was flippant, but I wanted to I have nothing against the sourdough. I'm just jealous because I'm not one of those people.
I know, I'm not a bread person either. I wish someone would send me some. Just throw that out there.
Could I jump in here?
Sorry, was that a comment?
That was me. I somehow, even though I'm hosting this, I seem to have lost my raise hand function, so I'm trying to figure that out. So there I am. I just want to make a brief comment, and thank you for this amazing session. I'm thinking of the idea was this post-pandemic studio, so we're thinking of how those who are working as creative people can function, but I'm also thinking about infrastructures and relationality. So I'm dean of graduate studies, so I've got an infrastructure, an office staff that's facilitating students who are then working in creative industries and that sort of thing. But it comes as no surprise that those essentially office workers, people who are doing the background work, are also in need of some sort of connectivity. Kelly, you'd mentioned that the Japanese notion of overwork. There's also another concept that was much pre-pandemic, which was usually young guys who would completely self-isolate. They'd stay inside, they'd have food ordered in, they'd be working at home, and they were completely antisocial. They're staying outside they would never see anybody, right? Often in their own familial homes, but staying in their room, right? So I'm worried about that too. And that comes back to what I was saying around the relational. How do we create relationships? And the office is a natural environment. You're there, you see somebody, go for coffee together, that type of thing. How do you then build that? And it's not, arguably those office environments aren't efficient because people are saying, oh, they're taking time and doing things. But of course that builds in a kind of mental health efficiency, right? So how do we work on that? How do we work on the relational and ensure that it's not just about economics, which is part of the reason for the big conglomerates saying, oh, you can work at home, right? Partly, but also how do we function so that we're functioning in both the human and non-human roles, right? These are important things. So just a question out there, because I am concerned about how we change things in the relational space.
Such a good question. Yeah. I mean, the first thing for me that comes to mind is the idea that post-pandemic we will be, like Katherine said earlier, it's not going to be a lockdown experience, and we will have this ability, hopefully. I've heard a lot of folks talking about shared workspaces, and also the notion that if folks have the capacity to work from anywhere, then we stand to result in closer family ties. We no longer have to move to be close to our office, to move outside of our communities. We may redistribute populations. We may strengthen communities by doing this. And so we may not necessarily have the same sort of relationships as we knew them because of the intensity of office space relationships. However, I wonder if there will be an impact on community relationships, on family relationships, on friendships, and those friendships that we sort of on paper consider to be like deeply, deeply important, but we often spend more time with our work folks. So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
I completely, that's such a good point. And Ashok, thank you so much for bringing that up. It is a real, I feel as though, when we talk about the world of work, probably, there's probably a statistic out there about how much people value their colleagues and their coworkers and the social aspect of that. And it's a huge difference to move from the areas of, you know, the spaces of your everyday working environment where you can chat around the water cooler or go for lunch or something like that, to being stuck at home and Zoom calling everyone. And I know we've made attempts at shoring up, you know, and trying to recreate that kind of idea of hanging out at the water cooler in some ways online. And I just don't think it's going to be the same, but it is something we need to take into account. I would love that comment, Kelly, that you made about strengthening our communities. In, you know, it's kind of like a flip-flop, like where the world of work social fabric has been diminished somewhat. Maybe that's an opportunity to build immediate communities.
Exactly.
And I absolutely love, you know, that idea of the non-human. I certainly feel more close to the non-human community of my household than I did before, right? Like there are so many plants and animals and insects, and, you know, like we're just surrounded by, you know, I mean, I'm super lucky to have a backyard, and, you know, this is something that I can see flourishing on a daily basis, when that wasn't happening when I was, you know, off to campus every day kind of thing in the work week. So I think it could be something that we need to, again, be aware of, and being consciously, you know, being conscious that there might be a shift there. Maybe I'll end up knowing my neighbors better than I did before. Maybe I'll end up, you know, being closer to, if I am living with family members, they will find out more about what I do in my job, which would be great, because I really don't feel like they know at all what I'm doing. But, you know, so these are things that are really, these are such important key changes. One of the things that I think, you know, from a communication point of view, there are forms of communication that are incredibly important, that a lot of people make fun of small talk, for instance, but there is a social and psychological reason for small talk existing, and a lot of people hate to do it and all of that kind of, these are the kinds of elements of communication that we consider to be less important, but they're the ones that are the most important in building relationships and social connections. And, you know, if we think about it, humans are all about social connections. We would be nothing without our social connections, right? This is how the world works around that, right? So yeah, hello?
Yeah, hi, can I jump in? Sorry, I also don't want to do the raise hand function, but just kind of to add in there, one of the things that I've been thinking about as a tool for, because it seems like, how do we make these choices? How do we, like, what are the questions that, I mean, that I've been thinking about that I need to ask in order to make the decisions in terms of how to navigate the like virtual versus in person, and the risks of, you know, to some level, I think we need to be like completely isolating until there's a full vaccine. Well, we need to be vulnerable to the world around us, to our family, to extended communities. So there's a kind of intention of how we bring people into our kind of bubbles. But in asking that, and in kind of addressing my suspicion into online, everything going virtual, is this question that came to through Silvia Federici, the Marxist feminist writer, excellent, but the question of who's benefiting from it, who's benefiting from my involvement online, who's benefiting from my exposure or exposing other people, and how do we, I think that's like a question that can kind of be used to navigate through the kind of co-option of the corporate world. To like, I get really suspicious of putting everything online and everything virtual, because we lose our kind of capacity for human interaction in this unmediated way, where we have to, like, just going back to the beginning of the conversation, Kelly, you know, you're talking about how it, you might not be doing this if it was in person. I kind of struggle from the opposite side in a way, because how I am able to navigate the world is more through my body, not through my voice. So being present to people, I can do that. Like already I'm like, oh my God, I'm hyperventilating just talking online because there's no bodies to kind of ground me. So there's, and one of the books that I've been reading is Silvia Federici's new book, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, and Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism. And she talks about the kind of organization of workers in union halls, and fiestas, and the importance of those things in order to exchange information. And I think one of the things that I'm really suspicious about is if everything's happening online, all of that information is there for mining. Like, it's being mined, and there's a huge debt in the natural world to all of the platforms and systems that we're using to do this. So while it's important to keep each other safe and keep the most vulnerable of our population safe, like, what is the cost of that? What kind of pressure and resources are we like putting on the natural world in terms of, we're at a point, so I'm sorry, I don't want to dominate the conversation here,
no,
but
it's okay.
I just want to bring up, like, we're at a point where we're talking about going on to online, and we need these resources. Simultaneously, like, the oceans are being divvied up for mining. Like, how there's a sense of, we're operating on this level, and what's happening underneath in order for us to maintain our sense of who we are as people in the world, and really, is it worth it?
Yeah, you've made, I mean, I completely, I take your point. This is like super, super important for a lot of people, you know, that human life is an embodied experience, and that we've suddenly, you know, cut that off in a lot of ways, right? Depending on our lines of work or on our like everyday lives. And how do we compensate for that? And why do we rely so much on the online space? You know, that's a question that I've had, you know, I guess being, you know, a little bit older and remembering what it was like to phone people and use mail. Like, why are we not using telephones and mailing each other? I know, you know, for example, my partner's parents were homeschooled because they lived in very rural areas, and they essentially did their homeschooling through the mail. You know, and I'm not suggesting that we should go to the, you know, to that extent, like in this situation, but maybe this is something that we need to consider a little bit more. Is I feel like the post-pandemic has fallen on us so quickly, or actually even just the pandemic has been such a huge, you know, it's kind of like just hit us like a, you know, a massive, extreme, fast event, and we need to think very carefully about ways that we can diversify the ways that we can connect with people.
Yeah, I think that's it. Sorry, just I think that's a good point that you bring up. And one of the things of this, like, let's, instead of feeling like we continually have to look forward, like, let's look back and honor those technologies that we've already developed and the infrastructure that's already there. One of the things in terms of post-pandemic studio practice and thinking around education, and like, what about the model of God, I can't think of the word now, apprenticeship, you know, like, and that exists in some artist studios in terms of people who are working for them, but and a kind of a sense of acknowledged apprenticeship, but if that becomes the community, you know, it takes the place of a lot of schools, particularly for me, coming from sculpture and materials, like, and having conversations with people. How do you teach sculpture online? Like, it automatically goes through a certain set of materials, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I love that idea of the apprenticeship model taking more of an important role in education and in practice, like formation for creative practices. It would be wonderful to see something like that emerge in design and art, where we don't have that clustering of like large numbers of people in classrooms, but perhaps take on alternative formats where we're taking smaller numbers in, maybe doing more assistantships and apprenticeships, and yeah, and not just those really resource intensive, you know, structural, you know, environmental practices, but you know, even our own practices of like communication design and others would really benefit from that.
Yeah, thank you so much for, sorry, Katherine.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much for pushing through and like going outside of your comfort zone and sharing that, because I think you shared some really amazing insights, and you're really getting us thinking. And a couple things come to mind for me out of what you said. The first one is about my personal hope that out of the pandemic and into the post-pandemic, that the result is, instead of an increased reliance on digital platforms and the online world, the result is actually more of a flexibility and a willingness and a social acceptability for us to work and practice in the ways that work for us. So for you, as someone who needs that embodied experience and to be engaging physically, you know, with your craft and with other folks, then that is something that can happen. And for someone like myself who, you know, needs a little bit less of the interpersonal and a little bit more downtime to sort of not be so overwhelmed by stimulus, like, we can all do that, is sort of the first piece that I just hope it's in the same way in health design. We talk a lot about personalized medicine. I hope we talk about personalizing work. And the other piece that you brought up is like, who's benefiting out of us moving onto these online platforms? And even if it's only some of us, currently it's a lot of us. And yeah, absolutely, there are a lot of people who are massively earning from this. I mean, we all are seeing the notes on Zuckerberg and Bezos and all of these folks. And so you bring up a really interesting point about who owns those platforms, and if these become like a crucial piece of our social fabric, then do we need to completely rethink that structure? Do they need to be owned by someone else? Does it need to be returned to the people? These become questions, as well as, of course, the discussions around universal access to technology and Wi-Fi and things like that. But great comment, thank you.
I noticed that Rania has a hand raised, or is that
yeah.
Do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Hey. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I feel like I've been talking too much today, but I just wanted to bring up that I just recently had a discussion with one of our colleagues here at the residency, Grace. She's here too, and she's looking at and you know, the whole, I'm not going to speak about her project. She would do it. We were talking about how we're going to be transitioning education online and all that, and about building relationships and all. And we were saying how it's so important. I was sharing with her Montessori principles and how Montessori has built a lot of her education principles on human tendencies. And I think what again, maybe it goes back to that point of how are we preparing for post-pandemic, is we need to, I feel like we just need to bring in that interdisciplinary group that is able to kind of look at how are we building relationships online, working with physical human tendencies, because they're two different things. And so you can try to make technology fill a lot of voids and things like that, but if it's not built into your human tendencies, it won't happen for you. And I know, like, this is not going anywhere useful, but if you've read the book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, Noah Harari, it's a beautiful book. And what I liked about a lot of the scenarios that he gave was that he was asking a question no one wanted to address yet, which is, these technologies are coming, they're inevitable, they're here, they're already here. But what we're not talking about is what are they going to do? And so maybe what is asked of a group like us is we need to take more, okay, fine, that's great, we'll all stay online forever now. We're all not going, let's say social distancing is happening for good. What does that mean for humanity? What's that going to look like? How is that going to impact how our kids are going to work? What kind of human being will it be if you're going to, I think no one wants to sit and imagine this. Maybe it's scary, but no one wants to sit and imagine it. And I think someone has to. It's evident. Someone just needs to, because it is. And someone had in the chat that this was happening way before pandemic. Yes, it was, and it was already starting to get scary. So can we start diving into the dimensions of what a human being is going to look like now?
Mm-hmm. There are some areas of academic research around that I like sort of lightly got into when I was doing my master's, and there's this whole group of folks that I didn't know existed who are in the philosophy of technology, and that's exactly what they're talking about. And maybe Katherine and I talked about putting together a little bit of a reading list following up this talk and some resources. So maybe I can include some of the readings that I've done from that, and maybe some of the folks for you to look into as well. Because you have people like Neil Postman who, you know, were sort of a bit prophetic about how like social media, for example, was going to impact humanity, and, you know, talks a great deal about how television impacted humanity and all of this and so on and so forth. And now we're into this new paradigm where it does beg for a great deal of thought around the ramifications of all of this. So I'm sure there are people out there talking about this right now in the philosophy of technology, and I'm going to look for a few of those resources and see if I can pass those along as well. And I also have a friend who just completed her PhD in post-humanism, and that's also an area of study that talks a lot about the sort of human-computer interaction, and even goes sort of beyond that into past wearables and into the sorts of ways that we start to integrate with technology. And I mean, it's getting off topic, but that's definitely an area of study, and I'll do my best to find that stuff for you.
Yeah, that's all. It's it's so relevant as well at this point in time, right? We're all like relying so much on like technology, and again, I feel like we need to check that kind of that reaction, or that automatic reaction to immediate exchanges online. Can we move to something more local? I'm looking at the chat and I see Donica is mentioning, you know, nieces and nephews being sent iPads and you know, home from school to finish the studies. And I completely relate to this. This happened to us. Their knowledge of technology and internet exchanges and just that whole world of digital, you know, life went from, you know, almost zero to, almost complete, fully fledged users of the internet with their own email addresses and everything within a matter of just a couple of weeks. And I still don't quite fully understand the systems that they're using. And I can only imagine what that's like if you're also maybe not, you know, I'm privileged in the sense that I work with technology. So if you're not doing that yourself and you don't have the immediate capacity to support that, it's a real challenge, and it's just a crazy situation. I feel like it's partly been a result of the speed with which the school systems had to adapt. And unfortunately, we had a little bit of an upshot of, I feel like, still too much Zoom, too much iPad use, too much reliance on an assumption that everybody has access to those technologies, right, in those systems. And not to mention even an internet connection, right?
Right.
Not everybody here had an internet connection.
Yeah, I think definitely the the response to like being timely and kind of like that's they felt the best thing. But my worry is just like, okay, like what about the kids that get left behind that might have actually passed because maybe they're just passing everyone, but actually were not able to successfully or to their standard, like actually continue and like finish what they were supposed to learn in that grade or that level of education. So it's like kind of like, I don't know, maybe I'm like shifting on the idea of like, rather than just like pushing everyone and expecting, because I feel like that'll have detrimental effect on their like future in like when things do return back to normal type thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there are some people who are definitely more able to pick up and to run with the idea of finishing your studies using the iPad, and others are, we have so many constraints ahead of us, for various reasons, and access to technology, access to a solid broadband connection, that's a huge assumption, right? People don't necessarily have that ability. Time, the fact that, some people have a ton of time to spend explaining and showing and, guiding, their kids through all of these things, and others have literally none, or, it's just there are huge disparities there. I feel like in BC anyway, we've been constantly, this is kind of an aside, but we have that, this approach of trying to pick everybody up where they left off and not failing anyone. So it's a bit like admitting that there's this kind of like universal failure of, there's like there isn't enough consistency there. So we're just going to continue and finish the grades off in September when we were able to go back part-time or whatever it is. And so it is, it's a bit like just trying to shore up as much as possible, and probably realizing at this point that we have these massive inequities going on.
I want to be really mindful of time. It's 20 after 2, and I think we're supposed to wrap at 2:30.
That's true.
Correct?
Yes.
So I want to be the timekeeper here. And so if we want to open it up to a little bit more conversation, we can maybe share a prompt. What do you think?
Yeah, I did want to share, Kelly, shall I share my social justice prompt?
Yes, that is perfect.
The social dimensions. I mean, when we were talking about the meaningful inefficiency of post-pandemic conditions, one of the thoughts that I had that I'd love to put to you as a group is around opportunities for social change. And because, I'm looking at systems design and systems thinking is kind of one of my things. I see pressure on the system, right, that we live in, or the systems that we live within. And, can we have enduring benefits that come out of these pressures from an educational perspective or a health perspective, the environmental perspective, and the everyday life perspective? Zooming out a bit, I'm thinking about the history of natural disasters and how humans generally, thinking about the coronavirus situation as a natural disaster, humans have tended to let go of divisions that they had, political divisions or other kinds of divisions, in order to band together to resist the natural disaster. So whether we're talking about, a tsunami or a volcano or a pandemic, there's some evidence to show that people will tend to kind of let go of their differences and band together in order to help each other survive. And so I'm looking at how this is demonstrating, is this demonstrating itself in the present day? In recent events, I'm thinking about the most recent events surrounding the death of George Floyd and the public reactions, including protests, demonstrations, and waves of action, of various kinds of action in North America and elsewhere, dealing with anti-Black racism and social injustice. Has the pandemic somehow primed us for reacting to this issue in this way at this point in time? In other words, has the lockdown actually thrown fuel on the fire and actually activated people or helped to activate people in a certain way? And I do want to throw that out there as what do you think? Would the demonstrations, would the protests, would some of the violence have occurred differently if we had not been living in these, in this particular time, if we had just been in the regular everyday pre-COVID time?
I'm so fascinated by this question. When Katherine brought it up and first told me about it, and I just hadn't considered this, and whether or not we would have seen the same sort of level of participatory action around the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and the number of allies who have are and continue to support. And most of what I'm seeing in, we'll say the dominant news media, is that we're implicating, or we're crediting rather, social media with, the idea that had we not seen this incredibly grisly video, had we not heard this man's voice, we would not have responded the same way. And while I agree with that, I wonder if, to Katherine's point, there is a sort of deeper layer to this, where this I promised myself I wouldn't say unprecedented, but I have to. Unprecedented time that we're living in has impacted the action around this. Really interested in what everybody thinks. If anybody from the audience wants to talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of like, if we're looking at the new normal, does the new normal mean that people are activated in a way that will create a sort of like consistent and engagement, right, with the issues, with the social issues that we're currently talking about, you know, or is it, you know, another kind of like a blip in that, you know, what we saw prior to coronavirus was people would be activated for certain amounts of time and then forget about issues, and issues fall off the radar as they fall out of the newsreel, right? So what now might there be, you know, an opportunity for in terms of like more sustained engagement?
Yeah, you guys are asking a question, and I can't believe you're thinking we're going to end at 2:30.
Yeah, yeah. So actually, we can stay for a few minutes after we close the session, and this is also something that probably we should reiterate, that we are interested in continuing the conversation, and we will have opportunities to connect with anybody who's interested in continuing the conversation after this session. So yeah, we do have just a few minutes left, so we will have to keep this short if you do need to sign off in like 3 minutes, whatever it is, but we are able to stick around.
This is so interesting. Thank you so much for bringing it up. My personal opinion, yes, it did factor in, the quarantine or the lockdown did factor, and I think it was because everyone's emotions was already at a high, like at a different level, number one, and I am more and more also realizing and kind of coming to this point where I see that the whole pandemic and lockdown is kind of enforced spiritual awakening for people everywhere. And I think I'm seeing what the difference in my life that I've seen that happened with this recent happenings in the US is that it's a conversation that I would usually have in workspaces and with friends and everything, but this time it was a conversation that I was having with my elderly parents. And it was, you know, it was a time where my mom was ready to speak about this, to listen to it more, and me being of an Arab background to also accept me talking to her about racism within our community, because racism has different meanings within different communities, right? So yes, the short form of my question is yes, I think it's very different this time.
All right, so I think that we are, just to confirm everyone who's in the in this Zoom call, that we are going to stick around for a few more minutes. If you do need to go, completely understand, but if you'd like to stick around for a few minutes with us and close the conversation, please do. And yeah, do we have any other comments or you know, thoughts about that, or you know, other aspects of the situation as we're looking at the social dimension and the zooming out, right, of the implications of this post-pandemic?
I have a quick comment. I actually wrote it, but I figured I'd just say it quickly. But just around that question, I feel like for me the most important, or I guess why I feel like there might be more people paying attention, is I feel like the pandemic has, for most of us, like forced us to kind of like slow down and really where in being kind of like, I guess, like confined physically into like our spaces at home or wherever. I feel like we're more we're relying more on social media and things like that to stay connected and stay in the know, whereas normally we'd be like, you know, myself, I'd be running back and forth to work, school, everything else, so I might not actually check my social media for days, things like that. So I feel like that has been, for me, probably the most thing, where folks that normally might not have been checking in on these things are actually seeing it all the time because they're more present in the spaces, which I feel like has caused more attention, and I guess what we're seeing right now, where people are more involved, and also even like acknowledging like the time thing, right? Like normally folks might not, like it might not be acceptable for them to leave work and go to a rally or participate in something like that because they're physically in the workplace, whereas now it might be something that they could possibly do, right? But yeah, that's my take on it, I guess.
No, that's great. And Totally agree with that. We, I don't know if other folks in this chat are experiencing the same notification on their phone about their screen time percentage, but mine is like way up. And you know, of course, like we're just all a lot more present on social, and I think we also are in a state where yeah, we're in lockdown and we're with the same folks all the time. So we are actively reaching out. We're actively more participatory in online social spaces, I think, than we have been previously. I know myself, I'm like tweeting a lot more. I'm working to be a lot more active in those spaces than I had been previously. So yeah, I think for sure that's impacting. I hear you.
We have a couple more comments here. Oh, people have to go. All right.
Folks are running yet.
Yeah. Well, perhaps this is, I mean, I think this has been a wonderful way to, you know, to kind of end this conversation. Maybe this is a good time to wind down, unless somebody has another comment about that, or a thought or a question about that particular last topic. Shall we wind it down? And I would invite people who are interested to totally, you know, stay connected to us. It is possible to save chats if you would like to stay connected to either of us, the project, and just to continue the conversation in general. You can leave us a message, or we can also connect after the you know, this Zoom call is done.
Yeah, and thank you so much for everybody for participating, for being active in the chat, for sharing your thoughts with us. This has been great.
Yes, I would absolutely. I completely concur, and it's been wonderful to see so many people join us for this conversation, and really appreciate you know, your comments and questions and prompts. It's really made me think of some of these issues in different ways, and really enriching. Yeah, really enriching my understandings, and I hope it's done some similar thing for you guys as well.
Yeah, likewise.
Oh, and thank you so much to Ashok and the folks at OCAD and Jevi for supporting us with this fantastic little webinar.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both for coming in. This has been amazing, and especially taking time out of your obviously busy schedules and doing this, and thanks to Steve as well for helping to facilitate this. Very deeply appreciated, and multiple perspectives, and so thanks for everyone for participating. So thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Thank you, and bye.
Katherine, let's just maybe just stay around here while folks log off.
Mm-hmm. And we do have to save the chat before it finishes, if anybody wants to save the chat.
Catherine, Kelly, hi, it's Rennie again. I'm so sorry.
Hey. Yeah.
I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really enjoyed both your perspectives, and I'm not sure how to stay in touch.
Yeah, I think we'll talk. I was going to follow up with Ashok about this, and we can find out how to connect to you guys. I can see your name now, so I mean, and you know my name, so I think I'm also connected. We'll have hopefully an email to send around with some links to follow, but let's definitely stay connected.
Yeah, it's because I couldn't find you on Milanote, so I wasn't sure how to do that. So, okay, amazing.
Yeah, we'll send an email follow-up to everybody with those resources and our contact information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks for participating.